All right, we're back, and we're going to be joined now by Live Ready, the man behind the brand, a good friend, Sam Rosenberg. Sam, before we go any further, a blessed pass over to you and your family. It's great to have you back on KDK. Good evening.
Thank you, Rob.
And he's on the Metropolitan Window video screen. If you want to see this interview stream live, go to kdkradio.com. So Cody Balmer told investigators, Sam, he used gas from a lawnmower to fill the bottles and walked about an hour to the governor's mansion. He told the investigators he harbored hatred towards the governor, but otherwise offered little insight into a potential motive for the attack. Harrisburg fire officials painted a grim picture of what could have been what Fire Chief Brian Ederline indicated that the happenstance of a closed door, a steel structure, if it wouldn't have been there and closed, it could have been a different story. This bomber also goes on to say that if he was basically caught by the governor, he would have used a hammer on the governor. So you've said this for the longest time. No one's safe. That's why what you do at Live Ready is so important. But my question to you, an expert in security, how does someone walk an hour with two bottles filled with gasoline from a lawnmower, Molotov cocktails, and scales the fence and gets close enough to hurl this thing into the governor's mansion? Please make some sense of it if you can.
Yeah, I have no idea, Rob, how he managed to breach the governor's mansion. I don't have any idea from the standpoint of his security. Did he have protection detail on site at the time? I mean, police response was certainly very quick, but there's a whole lot of things that make me shake my head on that. But I don't really know what the dynamic was there. From a security standpoint, we don't have any information on that, Rob. What I can tell you is, the fact that he was able to get into the residence and apparently break through glass to do it tells me that there's some vulnerabilities in that mansion that need to be addressed.
And I'm sure there will be disciplinary action. They will address certain things. But I think the thing that we continue to learn is there is a lot of hatred in this country. Now, look, I alluded to this, and no one's really talked about it, but I think it needs to be talked about. There's a horrible thing that is anti-Semitism that continues to run rampant throughout the world. And any chance I get to stomp it out or to bring it up to where people understand the significance of what we all need to do to be more human towards everyone. I mean, being that it was Seder, Passover, hatred, and that word seems to always come up when you think anti-Semitism, you have to wonder, do you not?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have... we haven't been explained any clear motive, and it could run a whole variety of, whole gamut of reasons. But, clearly the timing and the target, being Jewish. I mean, this is one of those things where I would not be surprised in the slightest if it was a targeted hate crime in that way, Rob. I'll tell you from my perspective, when I read the news about this and I saw about, this type of heinous attack, the problem I have is that we are, as a society, seemingly hurtling towards this kind of assassination culture. And, going back to, I believe you and I talked before about the Brian Thompson. I know we talked about Brian Thompson's murder from United Healthcare. When you look at, kid being killed at a track meet, these kinds of incidences, and the targeted violence and the level of violence and the quickness to violence is unbelievable. And all we have to do is look at this dynamic of targeting Tesla. I don't care what side of the political equation someone is on. The reality is that the fact that that type of behavior isn't universally being condemned is unbelievable. We look at the assassination attempts on Trump and how they were sort of pushed aside by the news media and not really made a big deal out of in many ways. Even after all we heard about it, there are so many incidences of targeted violence that we're seeing nowadays that Governor Shapiro is 100% correct when he says we need to do better. This is an absolute outrage. And this type of thing cannot be allowed to continue. And the problem I have with it is, from a societal standpoint, is truly, we have sort of dug ourselves into this hole, right? Where there is so much incivility and there's so much animosity from both sides of the political spectrum, not to mention the anti-Semitism, the rampant anti-Semitism that has been allowed to fester like a cancer. over the last couple of years, after October 7th. It is an appalling situation. And quite frankly, I think we're just seeing the beginnings, not the end.
All right. So the other thing, just to kind of tie in as far as what's happening around the world. So I was watching 60 Minutes last night. Scott Pelley interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky. Literally, soon before the interview, 9 children were killed at a playground, bombed by Russia. President says he's kind of getting very upset with Vladimir Putin because he's not holding up to the ceasefire that they had talked about. And Vladimir Zelensky is basically saying he won't stop if he gets Ukraine. The whole world will be threatened. We need support from the United States. The EU seems to now be his single source of the ability to get what he needs to keep fighting on. When you think about that alone, that should be enough to frighten everyone, because if Russia would find a way to win this thing, and it's a real possibility, we could get launched into a world war. So the headlines, whether it's this governor's mansion, the assassination attempts on Donald Trump, what's going on in Ukraine, the world is really upside down. So now more than ever, all of us, including these public figures, they need to live ready, do they not?
Yeah, I mean, my slogan, that it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. And this is the prime reason why, many of the people that I protected over the years, doing close protection for some of the world's highest profile people, Rob, as you know, virtually all of them have sought some level of personal security training because they acutely are aware that their bodyguards will not necessarily be with them all the time. And this is an example of that. Now, this is not to suggest that everyone everywhere has to have a certain level of ability to fight and defend themselves. That's certainly not feasible for a lot of people, at least with their bare hands. But in my opinion, we have to come to the realization, if we haven't already, that at the end of the day, personal security is an individual responsibility. It is not something that you can exclusively outsource. You have to actually be able to take care of yourself and your own family and have that state of readiness, if you will, that you can protect yourself. From the standpoint of a home, okay, let's just circle back to the governor's mansion. I heard on the news blurb before we went live here that the fire chief is now saying, they're going to be able to put in a sprinkler system now that they're going to do a remodel. That's fine. That's wonderful. Okay. Hopefully the house will never catch fire again and never be the target of an arson attack. But sprinkler systems is not going to keep you safe from an attack. What we really should be looking at is truly from a defensive standpoint, why was the person able to penetrate the windows?
Absolutely.
I would think, we do this for CEOs and for our clients all over the country. I would think if you've got a house and you've got a potential person or family in that house that is a potential target, that you're going to make sure that the portals are secure. You're going to make sure it has the right camera system in place. And I'm sure they had cameras and security systems, but why would you leave the glass unprotected? It's an easy enough retrofit to put, anti-intrusion laminate on the glass and effectively virtually 100% prevent someone from gaining entry to the house before law enforcement responders can get there. So there are some very, very simple, called low-hanging fruit dynamics here in terms of security that anybody who thinks they're in this category of being potentially targeted should be doing. And it's as simple as doing an assessment on the house and saying, here are your vulnerable areas, and this is where you need to shore it up. As with everything, Rob, so much of it comes down to, will. Do people actually have the will to do what is necessary? I would think a governor's mansion should be as secure as the White House. That's just my opinion.
Absolutely. Last thing, and I don't expect you to give away any trade secrets, but you actually did some security for one of my favorites, such respect for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Why is it that Benjamin Netanyahu and prime ministers in the past, now they all haven't been successful, there's been tragedy there too, but the Israeli Defense Forces, why are they so good at what they do?
Because the stakes are so high, Rob, and they live and recognize that every day. So, there is no room for error. And that is just the reality of the existence over in Israel. And, unfortunately, And we don't want to live in fear, Rob. Truly living ready is not about living in fear and being afraid that someone's going to try and break into your house and firebomb your family. I mean, this is a heinous and truly outrageous attack. And these are still rare attacks. But home invasions happen too often. Active shooter events in workplaces happen too often. And the problem is, so very often people just look at these things, an incident occurs, it becomes high priority in the moment, and then a week later, psychology has moved on into other things and we're focused on sales and revenues and tariffs and whatever else might be affecting the business or the environment. And we're no longer focused on security. We assume it's just never going to happen here. And what we have to recognize is that in our society right now, violence seems to be an ever-present dynamic. And I'm not just talking about street crime. I'm talking about this surge of targeted violence of public figures, CEOs, people like that. And I've made the assertion many times, I've written about this numerous times, that bad guys tend to target what's near them. So this guy, the perpetrator here, lived in Harrisburg and targeted the governor. We don't know what his real motives were. Was it notoriety? Was it a variety? Is he mission-oriented in a couple of other ways? It doesn't really matter. The fact is that he was targeting where he is. And as a wake-up call to, for example, CEOs who are out there, there's a lot more CEOs out there who are responsible for their employees and their own family safety than there are governors. And as a wake-up call to all of these folks, you better get ahead of the curve, because if there's someone in your environment who is brewing like this, they're not necessarily going to target the governor. They may target you. So, now is the time for a degree of proactive security approach. Get a proper assessment of your workplace, your home, understand where you're vulnerable, understand how to shore up those vulnerabilities, and get some training.
What's the best way for people to find out more about what you do at Live Ready?
Just go to my website, liveready.co.
All right. Listen, Sam, thank you. I know it's a holiday, and I appreciate you spending time with me, but I think your voice was very important tonight. Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you, Rob. And happy Passover and happy Easter forthcoming to everybody.
There he goes, the great Sam Rosenberg. Love that guy.